Okay, great. Well, first, I want to say thanks for including me in this great symposium. I've been wanting to get to the ICC conference for quite a while now, but not there in person, but at least virtually. It's one step forward. So the presentation today I'll be discussing is called An Examination of Disability Inclusion in Canada's Coach Education System. And first, well, I work for Deakin in Australia. I'm located in Edmonton, Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory. I want to pay respects for the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and the First Peoples of Canada, who are traditional custodians on the land where I am currently working and playing as well. Okay, so a bit of background. Parasport can play a central role in disrupting, but also reproducing cultural beliefs and discourse about people with disabilities and what they can and cannot do. It's well documented that participation in sport for people with disabilities is very low. And this is despite the rise of the Paralympic Games and also sport policy around disability inclusion within many Western countries. So recent research has illustrated that this may be because of the relative invisibility of disability in sport. And when disability is discussed in general, often statements and discourse work to further marginalize an already marginalized group. So to help increase participation rates and enhance the quality experience of disability in sport, many researchers have recognized the coach as an important stakeholder in creating inclusive spaces and environments. So research that has discussed coach education, with disability often being presented as an in addition to, that is, if it's presented at all, and portrayed by more medical understandings of disability. Further, coaches coaching in parasport often have little to no training and often rely on informal coaching knowledge or learning experiences that can actually further perpetuate problematic views of disability and also understandings of inclusion more broadly. So while researchers have continuously pointed to the lack of coach education opportunities for parasport, no research has explored large-scale coach education to understand how disability is or is not being included. So this presentation is actually part of a research report that was developed in collaboration with the Coaching Association of Canada and the Canadian Paralympic Committee. So specifically, we analyzed the coach education content. This is through Canada's National Coaching Certification Program, or the NCCP, for 27 different parasports. The content included learning facilitator guides, coach workbooks, and other relevant modules and coach education materials that we were sent. So briefly, the NCCP provides standardized, inclusive safe sport education, sport coach education from beginner all the way up to high performance coaches across 65 different sports. It's seen as one of the most progressive and innovative coaching systems worldwide. So we analyzed all coaching materials through primarily a critical disability studies lens. So that's mainly the perspective I'm coming at for this. In addition to some of the key findings, I'll also present some practical recommendations for how national sport organizations or federations might structure and develop coach education curriculums for parasport. So our first insight was in noticing the different ways sports included content about coaching athletes with disability into their coach education program. So as you can see from the table, 6 sports had absolutely no visibility of disability, with many other sports having very little, and I really want to emphasize very little content. So as a result, coach education remains largely invisible to people with disabilities and therefore exclusive to only certain bodies participating in sport. For those sports who had at least some content, the structure ranged, so how they included disability content ranged from standalone separate modules about coaching athletes with disability to varied degrees of integration. So drawing from Goodwin and Peers, while separate coaching modules for parasport allows sports to provide vital information on the nuances of parasport, such as equipment, rules. It can also further reinforce ableism by reproducing the idea that disability and able-bodiedness are static, dichotomous, individual-based bodily differences rather than highly contextual, fluid, socially produced categories. So this can partly be explained by the fragmented nature of a parasport delivery, which has historically been provided by separate disability organizations. So that's partly explained by that. So to make disability more visible in mainstream sport coach education and even disability sport coach education, disability inclusion was also seen as integrated into already existing coach education pathways to varying degrees, as I said above. However, as I will show in the next slide, when analyzed critically, some of the content about disability could produce some unintended consequences. So how was disability included? So our second insight was in noticing the different ways sports discuss disability. In other words, we sought to explore some of the discourse of disability inclusion within the content. So when athletes with disability were discussed, there were clear tack-ons of nominal inclusion. So this meant adding disability to an already included drill or at the end of a sentence, or maybe just wedged within an already existing policy or some sort of discussion around athletes. So drawing from DePaul, this constructs para-athletes as only marginal participants. Also, Northway noted that we cannot just place people with disabilities in society as it currently exists and hope for the best. Coach educators need to critically adapt and change coach education to include disability in more meaningful ways. Importantly, some of the language used to describe athletes with disability actually worked to further marginalize disabilities, as it was located more in that medical understanding of disability, which views athletes as a problem or a burden on sport, and as an extension, coaching. It needs to be fixed through coaching intervention, which is typically seen as done through adaptation or coaches modifying their existing practice. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide in more detail. For example, as you can see in the quote, untrained athletes, athletes with a weight problem, and athletes with a disability, all included together. These are seen as kind of problem athletes, which is a very big problem. No, that is problematic. So on a more positive note, we also noted many sports reimagining inclusion of people with disabilities in sport through language more situated within a social understanding, which is a step forward, as I discussed some of the disabling aspects in sport and coaching, say via existing structures, and through accessibility a little bit. So common thread running through these coach education programs was to be more inclusive, to be an inclusive coach. A key skill was that you had to know how to adapt your practice. As you can see from the quote, just adapt your practice was something that when there was content about coaching athletes with disability, this was purported as the way to kind of go. And Taylor also drew attention, Taylor et al., attention to the importance of coaches developing this sort of lens of adaptability, which of course is important. However, adapting practice is very important. We need to take a more critical look at what this also can do, this sort of discourse. So first, practically speaking, we can't assume that all practices need to be adapted. Some athletes will not require adaptations, and indeed, it might do them a real disservice to adapt their practice. So it needs to be more critically thought of as we don't need a universal adapt your practice. This sort of language can be problematic. Second, practice adaptations that have been purported in past literature and through coach education. So these sort of models reduce the complexity of coaching athletes with a disability down to these sort of ready-made, take off the shelf, catchy acronyms such as the tree model or the step model. It's big in the UK, of course, tree is big in Australia. So rather than coaches challenging their deeply held assumptions about coaching, disability, parasport, and kind of broader society, coaches are told to simply to apply simple adaptation frameworks in their practices to be so-called more inclusive coaches. So as a result, by reducing coaching athletes with a disability down to these off-the-shelf practice structures, models, coach educators, albeit unknowingly, are probably unknowingly are viewing athletes as a problem or burden to deal with through coaches having to go that extra step to adapt what they already have existing. So it's that having to do more, which is seen as a problem, can really connect other athletes. Along those lines, third point is to consider what we are adapting in the first place. So to take a step back, what are coaches' normal everyday practices? This has been discussed in the literature as being some practices being based on tradition, based on what coaches have always done. Also, it's important to know that these practices have been, in many cases, developed for a very particular type of athlete. And athletes with disability don't always fit those molds. So then we say, let's adapt them. Practices have also been created, developed within the bounds of coaching's modernist disciplinary logic, which some researchers, more socially informed researchers, have already put forth as problematic. So we need to just take a step back and look at what we're actually adapting instead of just focusing on adapting. So there's kind of two elements there need to be discussed further. So as a result, instead of teaching coaches to just adapt their practice, it might be more productive for coach developers to help coaches become more adaptive to diverse athletes whose bodies and performances may challenge coaches to rethink what they previously thought was just kind of the perfect typical athlete. So it's important to understand disability in terms of the athlete, disability inclusion. It's also important to understand disability inclusion in terms of the coach education and who it's actually speaking to. So referring to the quote to the right, it's of course important for able-bodied individuals to experience equipment that they might be coaching people to use. But also, this also is described in a way that is assuming none of the coaches in the course actually have ever used this equipment, such as a sit ski, and therefore are all able-bodied. Adding to this, there was a little mention of accessibility and inclusiveness of the coach education, the coaching courses themselves. Having said that, we did notice a few examples outlined in the two quotes in the middle. If you want to just pause, you can have a quick read. Additionally, there were no representations of a coach with disability in any of the images, which can make it hard for a coach with disability to even imagine themselves in a coaching role at all. So through analyzing data, it became apparent that coach education programs, likely unknowingly, are speaking to a very particular type of coach. So, looking at this sort of pathway and who coach education is actually speaking to, and who their courses are designed for, it needs to be something looked at in the future. So this highlights the importance of developing coach education for parasport with people with disabilities rather than for. So just some quick conclusions here. I want to emphasize there were some great examples of inclusive discourse found within many of the coach education modules. However, this is more critical analysis, and we were really trying to draw out some of the problematic discourses that could further perpetuate inequalities for people with disabilities through coaching. So see some takeaways first. In some instances, separate modules can certainly allow for maximum visibility of disability. However, Townsend and colleagues also recently highlighted that infusion of disability into coach education, disability knowledge, can be preferred, can really work well. However, I think this needs a little bit more evaluation and to see what that would actually look like in practice. Next, number two showed us, or my second sort of insight showed us that the language used ought to be reconsidered and located in more of a contemporary sort of social relational understanding of disability. So this is something coach educators need to consider who they're speaking to. And coaches also need to go further than simply just adapting their practice to these fancy frameworks. They also need to learn how to be more adaptive to new bodies by challenging their assumptions of sort of best practice in coaching. So we need to kind of do more work within looking at coaching practice for parasport in general. In addition, of course, it's clear coach education in almost every case was speaking to a very particular type of coach. So therefore, research should explore what people with disabilities participation in coaching roles and that athlete to coach transition within parasport. to try to understand their experiences in coach education. And so we hope this analysis provides a different lens for coach educators to think more critically about content and its delivery. In future work, I'm actually working with Dr. Diane Culver, who's part of this symposium, to look at the experiences of those who actually developed this coach education to get some more experience, to get some more insight into those processes, maybe barriers from the sport management perspective, but also we are going to be talking to people with disabilities and their experience within, so I should say coaches with disability and their experience within coach education itself to understand accessibility and inclusion more there. So before I go, I just want to leave this with a quote from Karen DePaul there, who said that within coach education, there are opportunities to fundamentally challenge our socially constructed views of the body, ability, athletic performance, and sport more generally. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, comments, please send them to me to tconoval@deakin.edu, and you can also send me messages through Twitter as well, Konoval Tim. Thank you very much.